All right, everyone. Thanks for attending this week's webinar. I'm Paul Lefevre, the Xojo Developer Evangelist, and our topic this week is uploading and downloading files to your web apps. So I guess we'll just dive right into that. The last few sessions have been desktop apps, so this one is going to be web app related. So let's open up a couple example projects. Now, the important thing to keep in mind when you're dealing with web apps, and files anyway, is that there's two different classes you need to use. The folder item class, which is used everywhere to directly access files that are sitting on the file system somewhere. You'd use folder item in all your desktop apps, and you still are going to use it in your web apps as well. But in addition, there's also a web file class, and that is used for managing files that are handled through the browser. So either the browser is going to be responsible for sending them down to the client, or you're going to be sending them out to the browser client so that they can be downloaded by the user, or the reverse, whereas the user is going to pick some files and upload them up to your web app. Those are going to be done using web files. But the web files are kind of temporal. They just exist for the period of time where you have that browser interaction. If you want to persist the file in any way, you need to put it somewhere in an actual folder item. So enough of the background there. Let's take a look at the simpler of the two examples, which is downloading files. Now, there's two ways you can send files down to the browser for people to download. You can have an existing file that's sitting on your web server somewhere, and you can just put, like you can see here on this example screen, a button that will send that file down to the user. And that's the first button that's right here, a static download, which is essentially saying the file exists somewhere on the web server, and the app is just going to send it down to the user's browser to be downloaded. The other option is you're actually creating the file dynamically while your app's running, and then allowing the user to download that. And we'll look at the example here in a moment, but this is creating a text file, a very simple text file. But you can create documents and stuff like that dynamically in your apps and never actually have them exist as files on the web server, but push them down to the browser for the user to download and then have his files on their system. So let's take a look at the code here for the static download button. Now you'll notice the first thing it's doing is checking a property on the app class. See if it's not nil. And that's because the web file, the file that you want to download, has to exist for the entire state of the download. So you can't just create the web file here in this particular event handler, because when after the code runs, that's going to go out of scope and it'll disappear, and the download's not going to work. So you have to put it somewhere where it's going to exist long enough to be downloaded. The other thing to keep in mind is that multiple people connect to your web applications. You probably don't want to be creating if the file is going to be downloaded, if it's the same file, I should say, that's going to be downloaded by multiple users that are connecting to your app, it probably doesn't make sense to create new instances of the web file for each user that's connected when they're all going to point to the same file on disk and they're all going to be downloaded and the files are all exactly the same. So that's why here, and we'll jump right up here, in the app class, there's a little bit of initialization. And essentially, we're pointing to just a picture that's sitting alongside this app, this web app, which would normally be on the server for where it's running. And we're getting a folder item to it. So you see we're actually using folder item here because we're referring to the file that's on the file system. And then we're making sure that it's actually there. And then, as you can see here, there's a property called logo file, and it is a web file. And we're assigning it the folder item. So we're using the shared method here called open, and we're assigning it the folder item for the actual file that's on the file system. We're assigning that to the logo file web file. And then I'm setting the property of the web file to be to force it to download. And if you left this at false, the browser will interpret the file based on its type and then determine whether it's going to try and display it in line or whether it's going to download it. And in our particular case here, we're showing how to download, so we really want it to download. But you often are not going to want the file to be displayed in line because that will displace your web app and probably confuse the user. So most of the time, you're really going to want to force it to download so that the file ends up on the user's system. So this is the setup here. We get the file off the file system, and then we assign it to a web file. And the web file is what is used to kick off the download. And kicking off a download, as you can see here, is one line of code. It's incredibly easy. You just call the show URL method, passing in the URL of the web file. So let's see this in action. So I'll just click the static download button here. And what we're going to see here on this particular system is the file is going to download immediately, and then I think I have the preferences here set to show files, so it'll probably open up preview. So you can see it's a small file. All right, and you can see it's got a -1 because I already tested this once, and so now I probably have a couple copies sitting in my downloads folder, which I will bring up here in a moment. Yeah, so you can see right here in the downloads folder, the file is actually in the downloads folder, and it got launched into preview, which is not in the browser. So that could be any file. Doesn't have to be a picture, of course. It could be a binary file. It can be whatever you want. But that's how the static download works. Now, dynamically downloading a file is pretty similar, except that you're just building the file contents, at runtime. So let's see what that looks like. And let's expand anything here. All right, so first we have a property here of the web page, and it's also a web file, and it's just called text file. And again, this is on the web page so that the property remains in existence for the duration of the download. If I had just declared the property inside this event handler, it would go out of scope before the download actually probably even starts, and so nothing would happen. So you have to put it somewhere. Now, putting it on the page might make sense, but it might also not make sense depending on how your app is designed. This particular example, it makes sense because it's the only page of the app. But you might, for instance, have your app set up so that a different page is shown. So you start the download and then you switch the user back to, I don't know, the home page or whatever the first page is in your web app that makes the most sense. In which case, putting it on the page is probably not going to make the most sense because that page will possibly go out of scope if you're switching pages like that. So in that case, it might make sense that you put it on the session instead. But the important thing is it sticks around. So here, we're just making sure that it's empty. And now we're creating a text file. So we're creating it as a new web file because, again, you're always using web file when you're interacting with the browser, and we're sending this file off to the browser to download. So that's why these are web files. We're not going to do a folder item at all in this case, because we're creating everything here right in memory. And we're just setting the MIME type to say that it's got plain text. And we're definitely setting force download to true. Otherwise, the plain text in, I think, nearly every browser will just be displayed right in the browser. And then we're giving it a download file name. And the contents of the text you set using the data property of the web file that we've created. And you can set it to whatever you want. You could also use binary data if you wanted. Copying it from another file that maybe already existed, or I guess a picture or whatever you had access to. But anyway, we're just using text here. So it's just a little string that's just going to say hello world, and we'll put in the remote address and then the current date and time. Now, one little tricky thing that's being done here is when the download is initiated and kicked off by the browser, there is an event handler that is called. And it is the downloaded event handler. Now that's not actually called when the download finishes on the client, on the user's side, because the browser doesn't really have a way to know that. This event handler is called after the code has finished passing everything it needs off to the browser to download. So calling it downloaded maybe isn't exactly 100% precise. It might make more sense as download has begun and maybe might have already finished, but that's kind of long for an event handler. So, but just keep in mind that that's how that works. So what we're doing here so that we can access this event handler is we're using add handler to map it to a method that happens to be on the web page. And because normally to access an event handler, you have to have a subclass of some kind. And I don't have a subclass because I just created the web file right here in line. So this is how I'm accessing an event handler. And the add handler command, I don't know if I've covered that in an earlier webinar, but that's one of the more advanced features of Xojo. And it is covered in the advanced section of the user guide book 3. And it's pretty handy. It's useful with things like timers and other things like this where you want to access an event handler, but don't really want to bother going through creating a full-blown subclass and adding a project item. So add handler just has two arguments, if you will. The first is the event handler on the item that you want access to. And then the other is the address of the method that you want to be called in its place. So in this case, when the downloaded event handler would normally be called on this particular class, it's instead going to call the file downloaded method, which is right here. And then looking at this, the only other tidbit to note when you set these sort of things up is the parameter list here. You have to have as the first parameter the actual type that's being passed in. So it's a web file that we're doing the add handler on. So that has to be the first parameter. And then if there's any other parameters that are part of the event handler you're looking at, those would need to be listed as well. And this particular one here is just checking. What is it checking? It is checking that we have a text file, and then it's clearing it after the download has begun. So going back to that, after all that setup, you can see that the actual part of initiating the download is the same as before. It's just single line command. You call show URL, and you pass in the URL of the web file. So this part's really easy. It's just the setup work for each of them that you have to do. And you just have to think about how your app's going to be set up so that you're appropriately sending down the files. You're not loading up files needlessly and wasting memory, that sort of thing. So let's see what this looks like. And this time, I'm going to delete this file from my downloads folder first. All right. So the dynamic download here kicked off the download, the file came up, and you can see the alert popped up, and it actually popped up a few seconds after the download finished, and that just has more to do with the fact that this is a very small file, and the communication between the two apps, between the web app and the browser, was just so fast. But you can see this is the text file here, and it has our text in it, and you can see it down in the downloads folder as well, that it just came through right now. So this is the download example, and like I said, downloading is pretty straightforward in your apps. These are the two techniques. The important thing to remember, and I've mentioned a couple times already, but I'll mention again because it is the important thing to remember, is that your web file, you have to use the web file, and it has to exist. It has the instantiation of the web file has to exist longer than the download. So you cannot instantiate your web file in the method that's starting the download. It has to be in something that owns it, either the web page, either the session, or the application. And the other important tidbit is that if the files are going to be the same for all the users, load them up in the app class. That way you're only loading up once. Memory usage is only done once. It's just a better overall design. It's an optimization, if you will. And the other thing to point out is in Xojo 2013 Release 3, which came out a couple weeks ago, web files are a little bit smarter, and we'll talk about them with uploading, but with downloading, they're also a little bit smarter. And in the past, they were always loaded into memory first and then pushed down. So it kind of put an upper limit on it. Not a big deal when you're dealing with small little text files and images like these two examples. But if you had really large files that you were moving around, that's not terribly efficient. But with Release 3, files can now be essentially streamed directly off of disk. So that can result in a significant reduction of memory usage on your apps, your web apps that are sending files down. Because rather than, if you're sending down a big binary, for example, that was, hundreds of megabytes, now that won't actually be loaded up into memory and use up the 100 of megabytes of RAM before it gets downloaded. It'll just essentially copy it right from the actual folder item down to the web file, and then that'll all get handled much more efficiently using chunks of data. I forget the exact size. It's probably noted in the language reference somewhere, but I think it's probably something like 64K or something small. All right, let me just check the clock here. Our two topics today are not as lengthy as some of the ones we've done in the past, so I probably will have time at the end for questions. And since we got a break here before we switch to the uploading example, I'm going to run the poll now before I forget, and someone has to remind me. And if you've been here in the past, you'll see this is the same poll that we've been running, and I think they're getting a little boring, so I need to think about jazzing these up and come up with some more interesting polls. All right, let me close this poll. And and I also want to point out this downloading project is, of course, included with Xojo. So you can just grab it. If you go to the examples in the web section, I believe there's a downloading folder, and that's where this one is. So let's talk about uploading files. As your app design may require your user to upload files of some kind so that you can do Lord knows what. So this example here is going to show you how you can let the user specify pictures that get uploaded to the web application on the server. And then this particular app demo will also actually display the pictures after they're uploaded. But the important thing is to see how this, the various steps you need to do this. And you'll see where the pictures end up and all kinds of fun stuff. So the first thing to talk about is that, like with downloading, you're going to be working with WebFile a little bit. But unlike with downloading, there's actually a UI control that you are going to need to use to upload anything. And the UI control, which you can see right here, is the file uploader. If I can find it, I'll just type it in the inputs one. So there it is, file uploader. So you have to drag this onto a page, and this provides a way for the user to specify the files that they want uploaded. Now, unfortunately, you don't have a lot of control over this particular control. It always has a list and these two buttons here for adding a file to the list or removing a file from the list. You can, of course, shrink it to hide the list if you don't want that to be displayed. But the user is always going to need to have access to these plus or minus buttons in order to add or remove files from the list. Now, adding and removing the files doesn't actually initiate the upload. It just adds the files to the list. Say these are the files that I want to upload. To actually begin the upload, you actually call the method that is, again, nice one line of code. You call the upload method, and the upload method is part of the file uploader control. So essentially, the process is you add the file uploader control to a page of some kind. You add a button also to the page that essentially says start the upload or do something, but it's going to initiate the upload. And those two things work in conjunction. So the user adds the files, then clicks the button to say upload them, and they get uploaded to the server. So let's just, before we get too deep into the code, let's just see how that actually looks in practice. We won't actually upload anything yet, but we'll just see how that interaction works. So you can see here, you get the file uploader control. I can click the plus button, and I get the standard file selector here, and I can just pick a picture, and it shows up in the list. And I could click a picture, and I could remove it. So that's how the file uploader control works. Now, there are a few event handlers that it has that can help you out a little bit. And the first one is when the user actually clicks the plus button to add a file, the file added event handler is called. And this allows you to see what it was they just added so that you can essentially, like you see here, choose not to allow it to be added. So right now, this gives you the file name of the file that was added. And this particular code is just verifying that only JPEGs and PNGs are added to the list. It's not actually checking the file in any way, shape, or form. And you couldn't really do much checking with it because you don't actually have the full folder item, so you don't have the path, so you couldn't actually open up the file to verify what it is or anything like that. But you can do some rudimentary checking. You could even do checking of counts. So if you wanted to enforce that only one was selected or a certain maximum number, you could do that here. And you can see this particular code is checking if the extension is not one of those two. It puts up a message box, and then it removes the file that was just added. There's also an upload begin event handler, which isn't often useful. I have it just marked with code here so you can see it, but it's not needed in this example. It passes in the count of how many files that are being uploaded that the user wanted to upload, but there's not really much you can do at this point because the upload is going to begin. You won't be able to stop it. So, this might be used for some housekeeping stuff. Maybe you have something you need to update with the count or a few minor things like that. But overall, this is not going to be a heavily used event handler. But the big one is the upload complete event handler. And this one is called after all the files have been uploaded to the server. Once the files have been uploaded to the server, they're now in this web uploaded file, or in this array of web uploaded files. So you get back an array of all the files. So it'll be one entry in the array for each file that the user chose to upload. And then what you have to do in this event handler is process the files. If you don't process the files, they're going to get tossed and they won't remain on the web server. Now, again, I pointed this out in the downloading, but for release 3 of Xojo, we're making better use of memory here. So larger files are written to the temp folder on the server rather than being held in memory, which was a restriction in prior versions of Xojo. Because the file was held in memory, you had to have enough memory on the server to hold the file. And that limited the maximum size of a file that could be uploaded because Xojo apps are 32-bit. That means their maximum address space is going to take away operating system overhead and stuff at the most, maybe 3 gigabytes. And that's if your app's really not doing anything else. But with the files going directly to the temp folder on disk, there's not really a maximum anymore. So that can be a helpful thing, again, depending on what the users are doing. But regardless, you still need to process the files, because even if the files are uploaded and were written to the temporary folder, if you choose not to process them, they're going to get tossed. Probably, I believe it's when this event handler exits. Any files that were uploaded and are in the temp folder are tossed at the end of the event handler. And of course, if they exist just in memory, well, they're going to go away because they'll go out of scope. So, I mean, the simple process is you're essentially going to loop through all the files. This particular example here is just creating a folder to copy the files to. And it's just throwing this folder here. You can see here in the, there's a little conditional compilation here. We're going to be running it right here in debug mode. So it's just going to create this uploaded pictures folder right alongside the web app. But if you're actually running it on a server, you're probably going to want to pre-create the folder with the appropriate permissions so that the pictures can be copied into it. So that's just some setup stuff. The important part here is the loop, and this is where we iterate through each file that was uploaded. And then we check it and we determine what we're going to do with it. So I have this code checking if the file property is not nil, and if it is, we just load the, we assume it's a picture, and we're loading it right from the file that would be in the temp folder. Now notice I said we're assuming it's a picture, and assuming things is always bad, especially in programming. So you can see this is wrapped in a try-catch, so that if our assumption proves to be wrong and the user, decided to rename a exe file as, JPEG so that they could select it, when it gets to this point, this will throw an exception, and we'll, as you see, catching it here, and we're determining, generally speaking, if it's unsupported because it's not really a picture, we're just going to skip it and not process that one. If file happens to just be in memory, we're just going to create the picture right from the data that's in memory, and that will give us the picture object. So either way, we end up with a picture here. And this test is only needed really if to do the verification that an actual picture is what was uploaded. If you just wanted to take the files that were uploaded and immediately write them off into your own folders, you don't really need to do any sort of check like this. And this check does obviously impact memory because the picture has to be loaded and whatnot. But it's, these sort of example things give you ideas for how to process things. And in fact, you technically don't even need to do this entire if that I have here. You could just use the first line. If it turns out the file only exists in memory, the framework will do the appropriate mapping so that this all works. So it's not really a big deal. But this is the part where you actually save the file. So we're creating upload folder is the folder that we want to put the pictures into, and we're creating a new folder item for it, and we're putting that into save pictures. You can see save pictures of folder item. And as I mentioned earlier, you're always dealing with folder items when you're dealing with files that exist in the file system. And then we're calling the save method of the web uploaded file, and we're telling it to save it at the folder item location that we just created. So that actually saves the file. This is the big step here. This is what's saving the file that was uploaded to a location that your web app will have access to from this point forward. And then the other couple things, it just adds the name of the picture and some other information to the list box so that we can display the picture later. And I do have all this wrapped in the try-catch because things can go wrong. Obviously, they could not be pictures, so we talked about that one, the unsupported exception. The other error that could come up, and particularly when you're dealing with web servers and whatnot, is some sort of I/O exception where perhaps trying to save it, the permissions on the folder we're putting the pictures in isn't correct, and the save fails. So the picture can't be saved. And that's going to raise an I/O exception. And in this particular case, it's going to just throw up a message box and then get out, exit the entire thing. Because if you can't save one file, odds are you can't save any of them. But that is something you need to be aware of when you're attempting to write to the web server, is permissions have to be set up appropriately. And what those are depend entirely on how your app is installed, what the permissions are needed by, if you're running it as a CGI or as a standalone, um, and how all that's configured. You may need to set it up so that it has if it's a CGI, you may need to set it up so it has the permissions of the web server. But that's a kind of server configuration thing. But the important thing is that has to be correct, and you probably, going to want to make sure you check for error conditions there. Let's see. I do have a question here, which reminds me to remind all of you, feel free to ask questions while I'm talking. They pop up on my list, and I see them so that I can answer them if I can. So here's a question here. Is it possible to select multiple files or folder to upload? No, unfortunately not. It's one at a time at the moment. I believe that's already in our feedback system as a feature request. I also think that would be incredibly useful, but it's not in there yet. So certainly that's something you want for your web app. By all means, find that feedback case, mark it as a favorite or whatnot, and I'm sure we will get to it. All right, so that's how this is all working. So let's just run this so we can see what it looks like. So you see here, I'll add a couple pictures, one at a time. I don't think I can select two. No. Unable to select two. Figure might as well check that. All right, so we added my favorite sea slug picture. Let's see. Can add the lighthouse picture. And, we can add any number of them. Can add my cat. And then you can hit the upload pictures button. And this will spin while the upload is occurring and the files are being uploaded to the server. As it so happens, obviously, since I'm running this locally, the server is, right here on this computer, so the upload is pretty quick. And where did these go? Let's just go back here. So if we look here in Finder, this is our running app. And you can see this is the uploaded pictures folder that was created by the running app. And in it are the pictures that were uploaded. So they were copied over, which is essentially all the way from this folder where I selected them over to the web app over here. And that's the extent of that. I mean, now you can, I have a scaling algorithm that forces it to fit here, so it stretched out my sea slug. I guess all the pictures will probably scale badly. But, I have it set up so that it will just, when you click on it, will load the picture off of that uploaded pictures folder and then display it here in an image view. But of course, you can do whatever you want with the uploaded file. It doesn't have to be pictures. It could be documents, text files, whatever your application needs. All right, so that, I think, pretty much covers everything in these two examples. I want to just quickly go out to documentation to point out the two pages here. So WebFile is what was used for downloading. And you can see, you can ignore the delegate here. This is deprecated and was replaced with this event handler, which we demonstrated. There are a few other properties that you can see here that you can tweak depending on what it is you're working with. And the open method and the download method that are on here. So that's your reference for that. And then the other one is the web uploaded file, the companion, if you will. And same sort of thing. It does provide a few extra properties you can see to get types of the file that was uploaded, the size. names, the actual data, so that you can do, do what you need to do with the file. And I can't stress that enough, that you have to process the file in the upload complete event handler. Any files that you choose to skip or whatever are discarded and are no longer available. You won't be able to access them at any point later. And if I go back to home, someone had asked about uploading multiple files at once. If I remember correctly, I believe Taylor Designs Web Custom Controls does offer an alternative file uploader control that does allow multiple uploads. I haven't used it. Kind of going from memory here, but certainly if that's something you might need and you want to check it out, you can get the link right here from our doc wiki, and go there and play around with it and see if that's something that you'd rather use than the one that's built into Xojo. All right, well, like I said, these two topics are not going to take the full time today. So if there are any questions on these two examples or anything else you might have that's Xojo related, I'm happy to take some time now to answer them. And while I'm waiting on that, I'm going to do my spiel that you're going to hear me talk about every week from now until March, when we have our Xojo Developers Conference in Las Vegas. And this should be a blast. I personally have never been to Las Vegas. I'm very excited to go. But we've already had a lot of people signing up for this. So this isn't the sort of thing where you're going to want to wait till the last minute. You should probably start thinking about it now, and so that you can make your plans and ensure you get a spot. I expect that we are going to be announcing some of the sessions that will be available probably in the next few months. We just closed at the end of September the call for speakers, and we got a ton of people that submitted sessions that they wanted to present. So now we got to go through all those, figure out what makes sense. Probably not put the schedule together right away, but at least figure out what sessions we have, how many they're going to be, that sort of thing, and then get people the list. And I know people like to see what topics are going to be covered before they make a commitment, but I can assure you we're going to have topics that are going to cover pretty much anything you might be interested in. And of course, it's Las Vegas, so if you're bored with a session, I'm sure you'll be able to find other things to do. All right, and remind people of the forums as a great place to ask questions or help others or learn. So I don't see any activity here on the question board or my question list. So I guess we will all go home early, which means lunchtime for me. But I will point out our next topics. And next week, I'll be talking about threads, which is going to be pretty interesting because we have changed some of the thread behavior with release 3, particularly on Windows and Linux. And that's with regard to accessing the user interface from a thread. So we're going to talk about that quite a bit. I'm sure there'll be tons of questions. Threading always brings up lots of questions. That session already has a lot of people signed up for it. So if you haven't already, be sure to register. And the schedule for the rest of the year is complete and should be showing up here on the web page soon. So keep checking it so that you can make sure you spot what's there and can register ahead of time to reserve your spots. All right, well, we'll end this one a little early today. I want to thank everyone for attending. Again, if you have questions on anything, you're always free to email me, paul@xojo.com. So thanks everyone for attending. Have a great rest of your day.